Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Qatar becomes the first country in the Middle East to quit OPEC as a new dynamic takes shape in the oil game. Also this week, the dirtiest fossil fuel as UN climate talks took place this week in a coal mining town. And we'll look at why President Emmanuel Macron's policies are so unpopular with the yellow vests or gilets jaunes movement. After nearly 6 decades of membership, Qatar has left the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. The Gulf state says it wants to concentrate on gas production and that the move isn't political. It's the first Middle East nation to quit the oil cartel, and the timing is significant too. The high-profile breakup happened during a key week for OPEC, which is deciding oil policy for 2019. Al Jazeera's Osama bin Javed reports.
The world's largest supplier of liquefied natural gas is leaving the biggest oil cartel. After being an OPEC member for more than 50 years, Qatar says the strategic change is needed for its long-term ambitions to produce more natural gas. Qatar is one of OPEC's smallest oil producers. Its main commodity is natural gas, with the world's third largest reserves. Tensions between Qatar and OPEC's largest producer, Saudi Arabia, suddenly increased when the Saudis imposed a land, sea and air blockade 17 months ago. Qatari government ministers say leaving OPEC is not politically motivated.
I don't want to politicize that. I'm a very practical engineer. I've been running QP for a long time. The way I do business is really practical. So we look at where is the value, and I like to focus on efficiencies always. And I think it's inefficient to focus on something that's not your core business and something that's not going to benefit you long term. So for me to put effort and resources and time in an organization where I'm a very small player and don't have real say in what happens in that organization, practically does not work.
It's not been a great year for OPEC. Its largest members, such as Saudi Arabia, ramped up production, while others have carried out cuts, meaning the worst compliance by members in years.
OPEC is a bit like a family, and it has all the good aspects of a family, the closeness, but it also has the bad aspects of a family, which means the squabbles. So they all, like in families, they all squabble. And you all are sad when one of the cousins decides to break rank.
Qatar's departure comes as both houses in the US have introduced anti-OPEC bills. The so-called nonOPEC bill has gained traction after the Trump administration's increased hostility towards OPEC. If passed, the legislation would pave the way for OPEC members to be sued for operating a monopoly. As relations between Saudi Arabia and Russia have improved, Iran, Iraq and Venezuela have found it difficult to abide by wider OPEC decisions. Qatar isn't the first country to leave OPEC, but it is the first from the Middle East, raising questions about whether others could follow.
Well, Qatar's decision comes at a time when questions are being raised about who's really setting global oil policy. There's a feeling that non-OPEC countries, Russia and the USA, are calling the shots. Non-OPEC's power over oil markets was made very clear when OPEC oil ministers met in Vienna this week. That meeting was all about lobbying Russia to agree to any production targets. Oil heavyweight Russia isn't even a member of the cartel, but it's been cooperating on production as part of the OPEC Plus group. Meanwhile, oil producers have been hit by a 30% plunge in crude prices since October, as Iran's sanctions haven't taken as much oil off the market as expected. Oversupply fears are back with a vengeance. The United States is now the world's biggest crude producer and is pumping at a much better rate than expected. Joining us now from Vienna is Johannes Bernini. Johannes is the founder and chairman of Vienna-based JBC Energy Group. Welcome to Counting the Cost, Johannes. Good to have you with us. So who is really controlling the world's oil policy at the moment, OPEC or non-OPEC countries?
Well, I think OPEC realized some time ago that it's increasingly difficult to do it alone. So they have lobbied a wider group, which is known OPEC Plus, and Russia is playing an instrumental role here. Of course, those countries have a big say, and they can remove volume in the market. But what we have seen is that when the price of oil is high enough, you see a lot of response from the US. And so the US shale supply right now is probably the most pressing issue.
Do you think that with Qatar withdrawing this week, the first Middle Eastern nation to do so, that other countries will pull out of OPEC and we'll see more countries outside the organisation as part of OPEC Plus than within it?
It's very difficult to understand the rationale for countries to be either in or not in the organization. Of course, you can say there is a certain concentration of power with the bigger players. They have something to say and their decisions have a huge impact. But of course, at the same time, if you look on the smaller members producing maybe 200,000 barrels a day, 400 or more, those volumes don't really matter so much when it comes to the end of the day. It's always nice if more countries are part of it, but why do they contribute? Well, OPEC is a research organization, so having access to that research is maybe interesting for those countries, but also, I would guess, having an international platform where the politicians can be seen to communicate and to be on the same level with politicians of other countries. So overall, it is, there may be many reasons, whether it's influencing the price of oil, whether it's influencing the supply, whether it's influencing the political landscape in your domestic home country, or just to have an access to research. There may be many reasons for that.
All right, so what's going to happen now with the price of oil in 2019? We have this oversupply problem. Ministers have tentatively agreed to a production cut. Where do we go from here?
Well, first of all, the production cut is necessary because there's quite a lot of surplus right now. And it's not necessarily just because of the Iranian story and the consequences, but it is because a lot of supply is emerging from many other countries. And on top of that, the biggest supply addition this year, of course, is the US. And you may expect more to come from the US in the next year. So that means OPEC has to stay on top of that. I think that they will not try to push the prices back to the level where they have been. Remember, till last year, prices were in a 40-60 range, and only then prices really moved higher. And I would expect that the prices now stay around the 60-65 range and stabilize there.
Johannes, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
The week began with news of a 90-day truce in the tit-for-tat US-China trade war. The world's biggest and second biggest economies agreed to postpone further tariffs on goods for 3 months, starting on January 1st. The pause, however, doesn't mean that the war is over. Big differences still remain on things like intellectual property protection, something that a high-profile arrest has made painfully clear. The US is seeking the extradition of Wang Zhomeng, Chief Financial Officer of Huawei Technologies. She was arrested in Canada on December 1st in connection with violating sanctions against Iran. China has demanded her release. Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown reports from Beijing.
Huawei is the biggest private company in China, worth almost $27 billion, according to the firm's latest annual report. It recently overtook Apple to become the world's second largest smartphone maker. Meng Wanzhou is not just the company's chief financial officer, but daughter of the founder. A company statement says it's not aware of any wrongdoing by her. The response from China's government has been swift and angry. It says her human rights have been harmed, wants her immediate release, and a reason for her arrest.
China has expressed our solemn position to Canada and the US regarding the case. China demands them to immediately clarify the reason for the arrest, release the detainee, and safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of the detainee.
Huawei has been under scrutiny by governments in the United States and elsewhere over its links to China's ruling Communist Party and whether its operations pose a threat to national security. The CIA director, Gina Haspel, made clear where she stood during her confirmation hearing in May.
Would you purchase a Huawei phone or connect your phone or computer to a Huawei or ZTE network?
Well, Senator, as I mentioned, I don't even have a social media account, but I wouldn't use Huawei products.
Meng was arrested on the very day the leaders of China and the United States were agreeing to a 90-day truce in the trade war between the two countries. Given her high profile in China and the fact that Meng is well politically connected, there is one obvious question. Was President Trump aware she was going to be arrested when he sat down with President Xi Jinping at that diplomatic dinner in Buenos Aires on Saturday? And if not, why not? Last year, another Chinese telecommunications company, ZTE, was fined $1.2 billion in the United States over products it sold to Iran and North Korea. But unlike ZTE, Huawei has not so far been formally accused of breaching US export sanctions.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, Holy Land High, why Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank is seeing a record flow of tourists. But first, who exactly will have to pay for saving the planet is a big question these days. In France this week, we see how lower-income drivers hit by fuel duties have taken to the streets. We'll get to the situation in France a little later in the programme. But first, let's go to Poland, where the UN climate talks known as COP24 got underway this week in a coal mining town. It's a chosen location right on the top of Europe's biggest reserves of the fuel. Wasn't an accident. Delegates have to breathe polluted air as they made their way to the venue. Their task is to create the rules to change the world's energy supply and change the planet. Naturalist and broadcaster David Attenborough had this to say when he addressed the opening session on behalf of the world's people.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
Well, this is the conference which is supposed to signpost the death of coal, the most polluting fuel. Coal use accounts for 40% of CO2 emissions, but the coal industry is still very much alive. It accounts for 40% of the world's electricity and millions of jobs worldwide, something the US government likes to highlight. So there's talk of a just, socially responsible transition. The World Bank Group said on Monday that it's doubling funding for poor countries preparing for climate change. But then there's China, the world's top carbon emitter and #1 producer and consumer of coal. OK, it's trying to curb coal power and the deadly pollution that it causes at home, but at the same time, it's facing mounting criticism for bankrolling new coal plants in other parts of Asia, Africa and the Middle East as part of its One Belt, One Road initiative. Al Jazeera's Rob McBride reports now from Myanmar, where activists say mining operations have increased recently in the northeastern Shan state.
Mines like this one are largely closed off to the outside world and have to be filmed discreetly. But the people living near them say there is no escaping the pollution they cause to their farmland and waterways. Sai Aoun farms just a couple of fields that he says are now ruined.
Since the company started to mine for coal, I've lost the water for my farm. My land is covered with coal dust and I can't grow any crops.
All around this area in Myanmar's eastern Shan state is evidence of mining operations. Recent changes in regulations mean foreign companies can now invest in medium and large-scale mining. The government has defended its increasing use of coal to meet the country's electricity needs, despite objections from environmental groups. And civil society groups who have been educating people on their legal rights say the relative stability in Myanmar could lead to a mining boom.
At first, we thought it's a great idea for development in our community, but in fact, it's not good. It's getting worse and destroying us.
Given the state's proximity to China, many investors are Chinese, but companies from Japan and Australia are also interested. And there are fears about a lack of regulation of environmental and safety standards in this remote part of the country. This underground fire at one mine was filmed by a monk who does not want to reveal his identity for his own safety.
We don't expect the government to fix this because the problem comes from the government. They are cooperating with military and foreign investors.
We are very concerned for our safety because we are a small local group, and we are fighting against people who have a lot of money and power.
Opening up to the outside world has been a boost for people in other parts of Myanmar, but for many in this area, the existence of coal under their fields and outside investment is proving a toxic combination.
Now, we've spoken before on the programme about the power of what they call ESG, environmental, social and governance investing. This is when investors leverage their power over companies to change their policies on things like climate change. Oil and gas giant Shell has been under pressure from investors to include carbon emissions targets in its business model. And this week, management signed a joint statement with a group of 310 investors. The oil firm has agreed to reduce the carbon footprint of the products it sells and link targets to executive pay. But in France, there's been a U-turn on a fuel tax. The French government has backed down on a planned diesel tax hike after the worst riots in central Paris for 50 years. The so-called Yellow Vests movement began as a group of unhappy motorists. In recent weeks, it's grown into a nationwide revolt against what is viewed as an unfair tax system and an out-of-touch president. Al Jazeera's David Chater reports now on how the so-called Yellow Vest movement took off.
It was the worst violence seen on the streets of central Paris since the uprising in May 1968. Scores of people were hurt and hundreds arrested in battles with riot police. It all began with a petition posted on Facebook by this woman in May, calling for a drop in fuel prices at the pumps. 1 million hits, and 6 months later, she was live streaming to her followers driving to the first of the Yellow Vest protests in November.
We're streaming live. Lots of roads have been blocked by the police.
The truck driver, Eric Drouet, called for a national blockade against fuel prices on his Facebook page. It's now received 17 million hits. But it's Mark Zuckerberg who is behind their success. The chief executive of Facebook introduced a new algorithm this year for the company's news feed. With this update, we will prioritize posts that spark conversations and meaningful interaction between people. The result has been the internet gets flooded by the Yellow Vest groups, and pages from traditional media outlets hardly get a look in.
Now that they have withdrawn from this fuel tax, they realize that's not enough anymore. So I think Macron is paying big time on this algorithm because it makes the game a higher game for him to play.
It was Ghislain Coutard who came up with the idea the yellow vest should become the symbol of the protest in a Facebook video posted from the south of France. It's received more than 5 million hits.
I hope something will change and French people will be motivated and go out.
Traditional forms of journalism are taking a beating. Television reporters were booed and pushed away by demonstrators during the protests last week. Media academics say, according to the demonstrators, the real expressions of the people can only be found on Facebook. And journalists are just another elite who are out of touch with the voice of the masses. Now students have joined the protests. The demonstrations are gaining momentum. At this high school north of the capital, 146 of them were arrested by police after clashes and herded into a garden.
Joining us now from Paris is Véronique Nguyen. Véronique is adjunct professor of strategic management at HEC in Paris. Véronique, good to have you with us. Has the French government done enough to put an end to these protests?
So the government made a concession yesterday, but this concession is arriving too late, and it is too small of a concession. So if it had been done 3 weeks earlier, they would have been able to defuse the protest. But now the balance of power is in favor of the streets. And the government seems to have lost control. The police seems to be overwhelmed. And the people that make up the bulk of the French society, the silent majority, they are starting to realize that they have a lot of power, they have a lot of clout, and they can influence the decision. So all the frustrations that have been simmering for years, they are now unleashed in the public space.
But there's a certain irony here, isn't there, in that President Macron is only introducing policies that were quite clear to everybody in the election campaign. I mean, that's why people voted him into power. Now they're saying, we don't like it.
Yes, but the people who actually voted for him, who really supported his policy, these are only 24% of the population. And if you take into consideration the number of people that refrain themselves from voting, you have only 15% of the population that are really in favor of his liberal reforms. And I think that Macron made major mistakes, both in terms of style and in terms of content. So he made a series of communication blunders. And on top of that, his policy is lacking clarity, is lacking relevance. So he did a little bit of tax reform, So fewer taxes here, more taxes there, and in the end, the level of economic levy on the society, on the economy, is the same. So there is no major changes, and what is really more worrisome for the population is that there is no end to the tunnel. So there is no vision. So why should they make any effort, any sacrifice? So this is not clear. And on top of that, his foreign policy is bet on a more integrated, more cohesive Europe, is more or less a failure. So he has almost everything wrong, and the population is bringing that to the scene.
And as far as governments tackling climate change are concerned, this was all about a rise in fuel tax, which ostensibly was to help with the fight against climate change. If governments can't raise taxes on fuels that contribute to climate change, how can they tackle their obligations when it comes to the environment?
Yes, that's a real contradiction, and what we're seeing in France really raises the question whether climate change and fighting against climate change is compatible with economic growth. Do we have to question our addiction to consumption, to debt, to growth? All those questions really have to be tackled, and it's sure that if you want to do something to preserve the planet and the climate, it's not certain that just marginal improvements to the economic system will be enough.
Veronique, really good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, this week, the Holy Land is experiencing its highest number of tourists in years. Israel says that October figures were record-breaking. It's exactly what Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank needs. That's where Palestinians have been struggling to make ends meet. Stephanie Decker reports from Bethlehem.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are now in the city of Bethlehem.
The Holy Land pilgrimage is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Now, who was the VIP guest and why? Judas!
It's been struggling over the past few years. Not anymore.
Well, you know, as far as I know, I think this year has been the best in years, and we were so happy to see people coming from all over the world.
This pilgrim from Brazil tells us everything is wonderful.
Where are you ladies from?
Kenya.
You're from Kenya. Is this your first time in Bethlehem?
Second time. Number one.
Oh wow, how are you finding it?
The place, very nice, very holy home.
Bethlehem is in the occupied West Bank, and the ongoing political tensions between Israel and the Palestinians have a direct effect on the tourism industry.
The situation on ground is the important reason for the pilgrimage and the tourists to come to not just to Bethlehem or to the Holy Land, to the whole region. And the situation this year was somehow quiet if we want to compare it with the other years.
Outside the main attraction, pilgrims wait their turn to go inside.
Most of the visitors who come to Bethlehem are religious tourists, retracing Jesus' steps, including to where they believe his life began beneath what is now the Church of the Nativity. But a different type of tourist is also starting to come, attracted by big-name art, and it's raising awareness about the political complexities here.
The anonymous British artist Banksy has been drawing attention here with his hotel next to the controversial separation barrier and boasting the worst view in the world. His multi-million-dollar art appeared on the separation wall last year.
From my point of view, it's not a very good idea to have this wall over there between the two peoples. It's unnecessary. I think it won't solve any problem.
This French family tells us they came here because of the artist's work, that they were shocked at seeing the wall.
Voilà, je suis chrétienne, donc je viens sur la terre de Jésus.
I'm Christian, and I can't accept that on a land that's so symbolic that you build a wall. It's not possible. There has to be another way than a wall and to terrorize a population.
Whether the visitors are here for religion, politics or art, Palestinians tell us they haven't seen this many foreign faces in Bethlehem for a very long time and hope they will continue to come.
Stephanie Decker ending our show for this week. If you'd like to get in touch with us to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC if you tweet me, or you could drop us a line. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our webpage, and there you'll find individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from all of us here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.